been a couple minutes.
Yeah.
There it is. All right, that's how we do it. Jacket on the floor back there.
I'll just put it on top.
Off camera.
Good evening all, and welcome to this Committee of the Whole meeting for the Village Board of Trustees for the Village of Lake Bluff. Do we need to call the roll?
Yes, I'll do that.
Clerk, please call the roll.
Member Ankerman,
Here.
Member Fisher,
Here.
Member Hatch,
Here.
Member Marquis,
Here.
Member Rappin,
Here.
and Member Ryder.
Here.
Thank you. Our first agenda on the item, and that would be item number 3, is our non-agenda items and visitors for public comments. The Committee of the Whole allocates 15 minutes during this item for those individuals who would like the opportunity to address the Committee of the Whole on any matter not listed on the agenda. Each person addressing the Committee of the Whole is asked to limit their comments to a maximum of 3 minutes. I do not believe we have anybody in this room for items that are not on the agenda. Do we have anybody online?
No, sir.
Thank you. So we will move on to the next item. That is our general business. First are the considerations of the minutes from the March 28th, 2022 Committee of the Whole. Do we have any comments? And first I should ask, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Are there any comments on these minutes? Thank you. Clerk,
Switch foot. All in favor?
all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. Next would be our core discussion here tonight, that is a discussion regarding the building code requirements for fire sprinklers in commercial and multifamily buildings. Drew?
So in your packet was a memorandum kind of generally summarizing this topic. This has come up over the years a handful of times and been discussed by previous boards. We're bringing it to your attention now, one, because as we get closer to the timeline for commercial structures to have sprinklers installed retroactively. We were going to send out another notice to the businesses to let them know, just to remind them of those that we're aware of that still haven't complied yet. And while we were talking about it at the staff level, we discussed maybe there's some refinements to these regulations that are worth talking about and getting good direction on. So Mike, Building Code Supervisor Mike Blake is here to do the presentation. And Fire Chief David Graff is here. We also have two guests, Ted Brown and Greg McCarthy, tenant of Mr. Brown's, who have followed this topic over the years.
Well, thanks for the introduction. So, fire sprinklers, we know they're important, but why are we talking about them today? As Drew alluded to a little bit, there's a deadline coming up before too long, January 1st, 2026. So just over 3 years away, that commercial and multifamily buildings that don't have sprinklers installed yet have to have them retrofitted and installed by. So we wanted to, make everyone familiar with what the requirement is, why we have that, and what the history of that is as the deadline's approaching. And two, I've begun the process of updating our building codes, working with our Architectural Board of Review, and hoping to have a draft of new code updates to move from the 2015 edition of the I codes that are published by the International Code Council up to the 2018 edition of the I codes, which includes the International Building Code, International Residential Code. That's why they're called I codes. They generally all start with the I for international. So along with updating to a more recent edition, part of that is we typically, reevaluate our local amendments a little bit and do any editing or tweaks we need to do with those amendments. So we wanted to take a look at that. with respect to the fire sprinkler deadline that's coming up. So a little bit of history of where these came from and how we got here. In 1986, Lake Bluff first adopted a local amendment requiring sprinklers in all new commercial and multifamily buildings. So prior to this time, it may have been required in some situations, if you're exceeding a certain area, doing a building of a certain size or something, it may have been required, or there may have been people who installed it just for insurance reasons or something like that. But 1986 was the first time we required all new construction in commercial and multifamily to have sprinklers. Then in 2005, when we did a code update for the 2003 edition of the I-codes, we added a local amendment for the first time requiring a retrofit of sprinklers in existing buildings for our non-residential and larger than 3-unit residential buildings. And we gave a pretty short deadline for that, within 3 years by September 12th, 2008 at the time. And I should also mention that we do have a requirement for new single-family homes to install sprinkler systems too, but I didn't really make them part of this timeline or this discussion because there's no date associated with any retrofit requirement for that. So that's just new construction for single-family and additions and remodels of a certain size, but no retrofit by date for single-family. So we really left them out of tonight's discussion because we weren't anticipating any changes really affecting single family. So in 2005, we adopted the retrofit requirement due in 2008. As we'll see a little later in the presentation, somewhat over half of the unsprinklered buildings brought them into compliance by that date. When we had our next code adoption in 2010, moving up to the 2009 issue of the I-codes, there's a lot of discussion of how to address the fact that not everybody had complied, and we certainly heard from looking back at the history. Of course, I wasn't here at the time, but we certainly heard from people who had told us that timeline was too short, 3 years, to bring their building into compliance, and we also heard from other people who had brought their buildings into compliance that they would be at a competitive disadvantage if their competitors were allowed to not comply with that code after they already had. And at that time, the village tried to balance those two concerns by extending the deadline, and they granted a pretty large extension, 15 years, a little over 15 years, to January 1st, 2026. And that's where we got the deadline that's coming up in just over 3 years. And at the same time, churches were given an exemption from the sprinkler requirement for existing churches if they installed a complete fire alarm system within a certain period of time. I think it was 3 years, and in all the existing churches in town went out and installed that fire alarm system, so they all qualified for the exemption. So now that we know the history of how we got that requirement, let's talk a little bit about why. I put this complete report in your packet. It's a bunch of statistics from the National Fire Protection Association, a report called the U.S. Experience with Sprinklers, and really does a good job of explaining the importance of fire sprinklers. As you can see from the line down near the bottom where the red arrow is pointing, they're referring to sprinkler systems as automatic extinguishing systems. And so they're saying in that lower line that 87% of the fires were in buildings with no sprinkler system, and that accounted for 98% of the deaths. So nearly all the deaths, almost, were in buildings without fire sprinkler systems. It's saying that 90% of the civilian injuries were in those 87% of the fires that didn't have sprinklers, and 88% of the property damage was in in the buildings without sprinklers. If you look up at the top line, it's really the same statistics in another way. The ones with sprinklers present accounted for 13% of the fires, but only 1% of the civilian deaths and 9% of the civilian injuries and 10% of the property damage. So we can see right there from that the fire sprinklers are really great at saving lives, and they're really good at preventing injuries, and they're doing a pretty good job at reducing property damage too. You see from this statistic that for every 1,000 fires in buildings with sprinklers, there's less than 1 death, but for every 1,000 fires in buildings without sprinklers, there's 6.7 deaths. And for every 1,000 fires in buildings with sprinklers, there's 20 injuries, not counting firefighter injuries. And for every 1,000 fires, there's, in buildings without sprinklers, there's 27 injuries. And then for firefighter injury rates, for every 1,000 fires in buildings with sprinklers, there's only 18, but for every 1,000 fires in buildings without sprinklers, there's 46. So a big difference there in firefighter injuries for buildings with sprinklers versus without, which is, I think, important to every community, but especially in a community with a volunteer fire department. That's got to be an important consideration there. Oops. So having looked at the history of it and why we're doing it, where do these requirements come from? Really 2 or 3 places. There's the national model codes that we adopt, and there's our local amendments. Here you see a page from the International Building Code that's has some of the criteria for when fire sprinklers are required. It's calling out different occupancy types and giving different square footages and different sizes of buildings you can build before you're required to have fire sprinklers in the national model code. So in a lot of situations, depending on the occupancy type, you can maybe build up to 5,000 or 12,000 square feet for certain occupancies before you're required to install fire sprinklers. But we still have that local amendment that we've had since 1986 saying all new commercial and multifamily buildings will have fire sprinklers. So some of that is superseded by our local amendments. And then as far as existing buildings, one of the codes in the family of I codes is the International Existing Building Code, which generally talks about when you're remodeling buildings, which of the existing features of the building you have to upgrade to bring them in compliance with today's code based on the percentage of the building that you're remodeling. Unfortunately, this code is not very effective at getting existing buildings that aren't sprinklered. It says there's a 50% threshold, but then it gives some exemptions to that. And the 50% threshold, unfortunately, is not cumulative. So for example, if you have a commercial building with 5 tenants of equal size, each of them has 20% of the building. If they each remodel one at a time over the years, you could have 100% of that building remodeled, but it's only, in this code, you're only required to install the fire sprinklers if you remodel more than 50% all at once, so you never hit that threshold. Even if the building could be remodeled several times over the years, you still never hit that threshold unless 3 of those tenants remodel all at the same time. And then it also has a caveat in there that if the existing water service is not of enough size to support the fire sprinkler system, that you don't have to upgrade under the International Existing Building Code, which is often true. Oftentimes you do have to upgrade your water service to have fire sprinklers. So to a certain extent, that's superseded by our local amendment, which gives us the January 1st, 2026 date. So even if the International Existing Building Code is not going to make people install the fire sprinklers, in all of these remodelings, we have our local amendment with that date coming up that does require it. So let's look at let's look at the, I inherited some spreadsheets from my predecessor. Yep,
I
sure,
just
go
have a
ahead.
really quick question before we
Yep,
keep going forward.
sure.
How did we, because I wasn't on the board at the time, but how did we come to the decision to extend out 15 years? How did we come up with that 15-year timeframe?
Well, I don't know exactly that there was any exact math that came up with 15 years, but that's what, certainly staff and the village board decided as somewhat of a compromise in the discussion between the people who said, I just brought my building into compliance with the code based on you saying that there was a deadline, and the other people saying, you didn't really give us enough notice. It's too much work to accomplish in the original short deadline. We need longer. And somehow they settled on 15 years as a compromise.
So the
there.
original number was 3 years?
The original was 3,
And then the
yeah.
extension was 15?
Yeah, right. In 2005, there was a requirement that you had to do it by 2008. And then they decided in 2010 to give it 15 years from that date, so to 2026. So really, since the original 2005 ordinance, it will have been 21 years almost.
And since 2008, has anyone come into compliance?
No, these are, that's actually a good segue into this spreadsheet here. These are the people who have retrofitted since the 2005 requirement was announced. And I think they were all done before 2008. I think they were all done in those first 3 years there. So 22 properties or property owners brought their buildings into compliance in those first 3 years when we had the short deadline. And then that left us with, and by the way, we do have, this is just the 22 that retrofitted after the deadline was announced. So we do have 66 sprinklered buildings in town, which includes, ones that were originally built with sprinklers and other ones that had already been retrofitted due to remodeling or whatever prior to 2005. Yes, Barbara?
Saying that in other words, that 15-year extension, of which 12 has gone by, has yielded a net of?
Well, of 0 so far, right, yeah, because, everyone waits till the deadline, right?
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Because when you speak about commercial buildings, you also had that same retrofitting happening for people expanding, affecting their house, their private property to a minimum of 30%, right? So there was also a lot of retrofitting in the village for private properties. You're going to touch on that, but I think this is important as well.
Are you talking about single-family homes?
Yes.
Yeah, so for single-family homes, the rule is if you do a remodeling or addition where the total square footage added in the addition plus the square footage of the remodeling is more than 70% of the completed project, then you have to install sprinklers as part of that project.
Okay.
So, and yeah, those are not on these lists, the houses that have added sprinklers from that code. So then that brings us to this spreadsheet, which is the properties or property owners that have not sprinklered their buildings. And the village was on the first spreadsheet for having, we did a couple of our larger pole barns in the original 3-year deadline, but we do have a couple buildings down at the bottom still to do, which is the Walnut House, which we acquired at some point, maybe after 2008, I think. And then our smallest pole barn out in Public Works, we never did add sprinklers to. So we've got a couple along with other people there. So what's not on the list? I mean, there's a few things that maybe were just, by common sense or whatever, not considered buildings that were never put on the list of need to be, but don't have it, which is like the gazebo or the shelters down at the Park District, which, seems obvious by common sense that you probably don't really need sprinklers in an open structure like that. But when you look at the definition, it's not really clear that they were excluded. A building is any structure used or intended for supporting or sheltering any use or occupancy, and we said all buildings were subject to it. So, that's the type of thing we can easily tweak and adjust as we go through our code amendments. A couple more buildings that were never put on that list are Salt Shelter at the Public Works campus and an open garage-type shelter for city services out by Route 41 by the DeMarie Industrial Park. So, you know, a little amendment like what we have in red here, excluding open-sided structures of less than 5,000 square feet, you know, calling them exempt would be one way to, an easy way to address that and clarify that, you know, apparently staff from the beginning never intended some of those things to be included, and we could exclude them. But what about other structures? There may be some other things on that list that really maybe don't make sense to put sprinklers in them. This is a building of ComEd's that's really entirely full of electrical equipment. This is on Green Bay Road, just south of 176 there, a historic electrical equipment building, I think from the days of the Electric Railroad. And, you know, my predecessor on the spreadsheet had a note that, you know, water and electricity don't really mix well. That can be dangerous to have a water-based sprinkler system in a building like this. So, you know, maybe we want to consider whether they could apply for some type of exemption or something. There may be a few other buildings around that maybe really don't make sense. I mean, the bathroom shelter down at the Park District down at Sunrise Beach has a you know, a furnace room with a furnace and a water heater, a little utility room and 2 restrooms, pretty small, pretty close to the exit door if you're in there to get out. I mean, it's, you know, probably not a lot of danger to not have it sprinklered. I mean, it could be an easy building to add sprinklers to if the water service is the right size, but it could be hugely expensive too if it means they have to run a water service all the way from Sunrise Avenue up top down to the building. And, you know, possibly North Shore Water Reclamation District or a few others are utility-type buildings like this without many people. So, you know, maybe we want to consider in our code amendments establishing some type of exemption process where people could apply for an exemption and make their case as to whether there's unusual practical difficulties in installing sprinklers, whether they're, you know, the degree of hazard from the building and the number of occupants and all that balances out to make it worthwhile or not worthwhile to put sprinklers in. You know, our code has an existing process to apply for, I don't think they use the term exemptions. I forget exactly the term they mean, but it's really the existing process is only for if you believe staff has misinterpreted the code. There's no real process in the code to say it's not worth it. And this is the it's not worth it application for things that, you know, that aren't really the same situation as your typical commercial multifamily building, and therefore maybe the same thing isn't warranted. And that's all I have, so I welcome any questions from any of you.
I'll ask a question, Michael.
Sure.
So relative to other communities and adherence to this, do you have any sense of what other communities have in place and if there's a tolerance for exemptions?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a hard one to answer because communities are really all over the place. You see everything across the board, and you know, people have a different degree of number of non-conforming buildings or buildings without sprinklers based on how long ago they adopted strict requirements for sprinklers to be installed. So, I mean, it's kind of difficult to characterize other than say towns are all over the place with all different requirements.
I'll ask you one that's maybe more answerable.
Sure.
Do you have a sense of cost to sprinkle? I mean, I know it depends on the building, I know it depends on the plumbing, but just anything very broad for us to get perspective on?
You know, that's a good question too, and that does vary a lot. You know, I know I saw a statistic for single-family homes. It was only like $1.65 a square foot, and I'm sure for commercial it's more. But it does also vary a lot based on, you know, partly on how far you have to run the water line to get to the main and that type of thing too.
Mike?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mike, from a from community by community, how do communities fit to VI code, and what is their timeline? Are we ahead of them, or how do we compare to other communities compared to their adoption of VI code?
Yeah, we're doing really good in that respect because, I mean, we're on the 2015 edition right now and moving to the 2018, so we're very recent, really. I mean, the 2021 has just been published, and, the thing about when a code is just published, a lot of the supplementary materials that come with it aren't published yet, so there's handbooks and workbooks and all that stuff that come out usually a year after the code comes out, as well as, seminars and lectures and webinars and all that, teaching people about the code. So, I don't think we ever want to get so current that we're adopting something immediately after it's published, because it's also helpful to have all those supplementary materials and all that. So I think we're really pretty much right in the sweet spot of where we want to be, that we're adopting fairly current codes, but, they've been around long enough that all the supplementary materials are out there and people actually have a little bit of track history and how to interpret everything and all that.
And what is the level of adoption of our peer communities? Let's talk about Lake Forest, Highland Park, Libertyville, or even North Chicago.
Yeah, I'm not sure about North Chicago. I think most of the others were looking to move to either the 2015 or 2018 last year or this year. I was looking at that last year when I first started researching building code adoption. I haven't gone back yet this year to see whether all of them did what they were planning to do, but they were all talking about being right in that
Thank you.
time frame.
One
Yep.
little footnote to that, if I may. So I think I started here January of '08, and I think at that time there was a push for the village to get on a practice of regular adoptions to the code, so as not to let it sit and not update its codes. And I think that was an issue, a concern by the board, that a lot of time had passed before we had updated our codes. And so I think that's one, just a desire to stay current as possible as a initiative. And then I would add to that when the village went back and reviewed these regulations, another change to the village's fee structure was to waive, like Mike talked about, that sometimes you have to increase the size of your water lateral to provide adequate water pressure and supply to run a sprinkler system. In the village, when it was reconsidering its codes back at that time, said we'll waive a connection fee for that larger connection. So that was one of the things that was done at the time.
Right, that's true. Yep.
Brad, I had a question, Mike.
Sure.
So we're talking right now, you really want to get our input on exemptions and how we feel about the exemptions, which many of those seem like, just at first blush, they make sense, and they're just common sense that we would exempt some buildings. But I guess I also have a question, given that 2026 is this deadline, and we've got maybe 25 businesses that are still not in compliance. How does that actually work? So they've got 3 years now to come into compliance. What if they don't do it?
Well, I mean, obviously we're planning to send out, notices as soon as we do our latest code update. But over the years, we've certainly been, these people were notified in 2008 and 2010, and we've been notifying them really every time we come in contact with them, every time they're getting permits or occupancy permits or that type of thing. But, and we'll continue to send notices as the time gets closer. I mean, if someone absolutely doesn't do it, ultimately, just like any code violation, our prosecuting attorney has to take them to court. And the penalty in the codes is a judge can award up to $750 per day that a building stays in violation.
Or order them to put the sprinklers in.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point, yeah.
Do we anticipate, I know this is maybe a little off topic, but do we anticipate as we approach 2026, if people are not in compliance, that we're just going to push the deadline out again? Or are we actually going to enforce the code? Because I think if we're going to continue to just push the deadline out, then maybe we need to look at the code and understand if the code makes sense.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's my assumption, given that that this time there was such a long deadline that we would not be looking at pushing the deadline out anymore. Yes, Barbara?
Just as a practical consideration, I know that we've heard from building owners before who have not complied, or who have complied, and they feel, again, that they're at a competitive disadvantage because they've invested X number of dollars in their facility. But if I were looking at spaces and one space had fire sprinkle protection and the other space did not, I would imagine that I would be very interested and attracted to a space that had that protection as opposed to one that did not. If I'm only looking at the bottom line and being short-sighted, I might not, but nobody wants their business to go up in flames, and their computers and their records and all that. And then, so theoretically, they could be charging more rent because they're more safe than another space.
Right.
And if I'm a building owner and I have to insure it, and I've got a space that is sprinkled versus no AES, I would imagine that would be an impact on the rates that I pay.
I would think so.
And so it almost seems like we need a marketing campaign to really kind of look at the global, benefit, besides the benefit of, hey, people don't die and businesses don't have to, go offline for so long because, only one room gets sprinkled and the fire goes away, as opposed to 80% of the building gets totally destroyed. And so it just seems like the early adopters are the rule followers. The non-early adopters didn't do anything over 12 years. It seems like we need to do something different. I don't think we want to have a big threatened with litigation stick as the only thing. That seems not, I don't think that's the kind of who we want to be.
Community-friendly, yeah.
Right? But I think that maybe just kind of trying to look at it more holistically and kind of marketing, for lack of a better word, educating about how it might not be as expensive, and then kind of maybe restating, if you did need that lateral connection, we would waive those kinds of fees, something that's more of a carrot.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it does occur to me, actually, in response to an earlier question, there was one building that did add fire sprinklers very recently. Ragsdale just did this year. So there was one later than 2008 that moved from one column to the other on that list.
Well, all of those buildings and descriptions of things that we might consider for exemption, just like Trustee Marquis had said, they seem like very logical and reasonable, and having a process for that type of thing would make sense for an exemption. I think that makes sense.
Sure.
And I think that just bringing more people into compliance voluntarily for the benefit of the whole village, that it's not good for a village to have buildings that go up in, flames, and our fire department needing to be deployed and put at risk and all of those things. So it would behoove us as a village that, even though it might be a little bit of a cost to do something, in the end, we're putting less firefighters at risk. We are making the village a more friendly, we don't want to be known as, the big fire of 2022 village, right? That's not a good marketing, branding kind of thing.
It's not.
No, it's not.
No, it's not.
I'm just thinking, because we've been asking about what other communities are, how they have their codes and what have you. Maybe we look at other communities and see what their incentives are. Maybe we flip it a little bit and say, okay, what are the incentives that other communities are using to get people into compliance? If they need some sort of little incentive, some carrot.
So my question, though, is, are we going to then have a room full of angry early adopters because they didn't have an incentive?
But we could probably manage that and figure something out for them. I mean, I feel like if it's something that's very important and we're trying to get everyone into compliance, then we could, we can, just like we did with the HPC, we can figure out something where we try to bring more people in and we make sure that everyone gets something.
Well, and
for
they had the
having done.
benefit of 15 years of being more safe. I mean,
So what actually begs the question, following Joy's comment, it was very good, that is, I think you said we have 75 buildings, 75 different enterprises, and 25 did not comply to this date?
No, there's 66 buildings with sprinklers in them in town. Of those, I think 22 were retrofits after 2003, and there's 18 that don't have sprinklers.
And so how does that compare to other communities, such as, for example, Libertyville? Do you have those numbers, or this is too difficult to get?
I don't, and I think in a lot of cases, the towns don't even have those numbers. Not everybody has done the research and compiled numbers on their buildings.
Mike, not to put you on the spot, but just
Yeah.
if the exemption program that you're talking about was implemented, of those remaining structures, which ones, how long would that list, would it shrink?
Seems like.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, you know, there's 3 buildings I mentioned out of that 18, and, you know, so maybe 3 or 4 would go down off of that 18. You know, possibly North Shore Sanitary District and ComEd and buildings in Park District, some of them, not all of them.
Does the Park District have sprinklers in the main building?
They do, yeah, the main building. Yeah, they've sprinklers in the main building and sprinklers in the Paddle Hut building and sprinklers in their largest pole barn storage building.
Okay, so when you say Park District, you're talking more the open structures like at Artesian or at the beach or?
Well, they have the club.
Purposes, yes.
Yes,
Yeah, right, yeah,
right.
exactly. So
Are there other?
the clubhouse at the golf course
Oh,
would be
okay.
one that we would probably not want to give an exemption to because of the number of people that can occupy that structure. You know, it's a higher hazard occupancy,
Okay,
yeah.
thank you.
I'll chime in on this. I think, or we've given folks a long time to comply to this, probably, 15-year extension's pretty good. The village, life safety is non-negotiable. And the use of fire services is non-negotiable. If I were a business owner, I either would have complied with this because I was gonna follow the rules originally, or I'm just having a tough time wrapping my head around spending the money to do this, and it's a hard thing to do. I heard this gentleman mention it's a disruption to the business, so it's hard. There's a burden put on our business people, but to me, fire safety is non-negotiable. You're sending letters out. I would recommend that we send a letter out that, to Barbara's point, has all the positive benefits that happen, and then some of the things that if this isn't done, the burden that it puts on the village of safety and all of that. But I would say here are the exemptions. This is a hard rule by 2026, and please let us know your intention. It's not really negotiable, and I think as a board, we're here to listen to exemptions, and even if somebody has something outside of that list of exemptions, if it makes sense to us, we can listen to it. But I feel like we need to bring people to the table.
What I think I hear on the board is an issue of fairness. That is, and I also hear David Graff with the fire department, who is advocating for it saves life, literally. What I hear also is an undue burden on businesses, and many people have complied. So the issue of fairness, where people did the legwork and the investment to bring these structures to compliance.
Mm-hmm. Right. And, having had the 15-year deadline, it did give people potentially an opportunity to install the sprinklers during their remodeling for spaces that were remodeled, which was probably a lot of them in that time.
I just wanted to ask, to push a little harder on the dollars that it would take to retrofit, because you had said something like $1.50 a square foot.
I think $1.60 for a single family.
Okay, so let's just say it's $2 and I have a 2,000 square foot house. Does that mean that I could do a home for $4,000? Or is that more like a broad number that goes over a large commercial space of?
Well, that number was, if it's installed with the construction too, that wasn't a retrofit
At the
number.
time, at the time of construction?
Yeah,
But
right.
would that be
For
more of a
houses.
residential or a commercial type benchmark?
The number I had was for residential.
Oh, so that's
Yeah,
residential?
At the time, it installed
Really?
at the time of
So that's
construction.
pretty inexpensive though. If you've got, I don't know, a 3,000 square foot house, that's only $6,000 for
Right.
sprinkling the whole
Yeah,
house?
that's right, yeah.
And over that period of time, you can refinance your property as well and plan for that. Plan
Yeah.
to spend some money, so.
Yeah.
I mean, I hear you very well on the $1.65 per square foot, but what I also see is in your presentation, the ratio of people being saved is 7 times,
Right,
from 0.7 to 6.7, I think you said.
right.
I mean, this is important. We are also a community and we care for the people living here.
Right.
Have you heard from anyone who hasn't retrofitted? Have you heard from anyone? Okay. I'd like to hear like what the thought, you know, like what, I think
Sure.
I know what it is, but I'd love to hear it.
Let's,
I can let you come up here.
Yeah.
let's have Mike wrap up and please come to the
Yeah,
lectern and
let me just-
introduce yourself. Thank you, Mike.
Sure.
Please. Could you please state your name? for the
Sure.
record?
My name's Ted Brown, and I guess at the risk of sounding like some pyromaniac that has no regard for human life or sanctity of life, I'd just like to raise a few counterpoints that I think are pertinent for something like this. One, and I'm thinking here like how to tee this up, but in terms of the companies or the businesses that have not complied, some buildings are simple or very easy to retrofit. The building that I own is extremely difficult to retrofit. Partially, I've got to bring in an 8-inch water main, so disconnecting the water supplies for the existing tenants, redoing the water supplies, plus the installation of the system is more along the lines of $10 a square foot. And if I could write a check and just, write a check and it's over with, that's one thing. But I have businesses that are very difficult to interrupt. One would be my tenant here, Greg McCarthy, and I don't want to give a lot of details. Probably in private would be better, but there's very large risks involved in adding a sprinkler system to his business. I have a vet, so operating dog daycare. I have a fitness facility, and I have a government contractor that is at a level 3 security clearance, which is equal to the Pentagon. So getting people in there and out of there to do this work creates some issues. I think the statistics that Mike gave require a little deeper dive, because from everything that I've read and understand, when the sprinkler system goes off, the people in the building are dead. The sprinkler system is made for preservation of property. It is not to save lives. To save lives is an alarm system. I've installed an alarm system in my building per the code and the requirements to do so related to tenants moving out and tenants moving in to the tune of just short of $100,000. So I am not adverse to supplying and complying with things that are life safety related, but in terms of what we're really doing, I mean, in the 15 years that we've had this moratorium on compliance, how many fires have we had? And that's not to say that there aren't any, but the issues of life safety also, and again, a deeper dive into the statistics, 85% of fire-related deaths are residential. So if your goal is life safety, you have to retrofit every home in Lake Bluff. That's where the deaths occur. And the fact that they have a sprinkler system or not a sprinkler system, that is not the determinant for lives saved. It's an alarm system. So I think we're conflating a little bit between life safety and alarm systems and what can be done to ensure the safety of the residents, to get them out of the building in time and property. It was stated to me once by that I would save the cost of the sprinkler system just in my premiums for my insurance. Well, if my insurance premiums were zero for the next 50 years, I wouldn't come close to paying for my sprinkler system. So the buildings, the risk, Tangley Oaks is a building up there owned by Charlatos. I have no clue how you would retrofit the Tangley Oaks mansion for sprinklers. it's all masonry. How do you do it? And us foot draggers are less concerned about the money, although that's a factor, but it's just, how do you do it, and what are we really looking to accomplish? And if it's life safety, the alarm system we have is state-of-the-art, and it works well, and I like to see some kind of appeal process for businesses and really measuring the risk related to fire and fire safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. Could I please have Chief Graff give your opinion, if you could, Dave? Could you please give us a sense of what Lake Bluff is exposed to in terms of risk, and from your standpoint as chief? If you can. I'm sorry about the putting you on the spot.
I'm sorry, I couldn't fully hear your question, sir.
Again, as a counterpoint to Mr. Ted Brown, could you give us your experience as fire chief in Lake Bluff to what you have seen, how sprinklers help you, or how do they affect people and property, and what is your experience since 2008, for example?
Thank you very much for the question. I'm not sure where to begin, Ted. I would probably differ with just about everything you said. From standpoint and so forth, I don't really want to take everybody's time to go over the statistics that Mike presented and so forth. But the benefit of sprinkler systems is certainly life safety. I think it's been documented, over the years. It's also property conservation. There are engineering ways to deal with most any existing structure for the retrofit for the least possible disruption. Those things can be worked out, managed, and so forth. Various types of construction lead to various types of methods and installation processes. To your particular concern, sir, for your fur vault and so forth, there are different ways to protect high-valued properties, whether it be a computer room, whether it be other types of significant storage and so forth. There are ways to engineer around that and provide automatic extinguishing systems that can deal with the contents inside. Basically, I'm very familiar with your high-security tenant, having gone to your building for fire alarms for that location. I would also mention to you that your client, Yuppie Puppy, we have met with them several times, really nice people. The owner-operator is very concerned about fire safety. They approached us to work with them on developing a plan. They're aware of the fact that their structure is not currently sprinkled, and how one would deal with the vast number of animals that they have in the building. For example, your Yuppie Puppy owner-operator has worked with us, and we have a plan how to remove the dogs from the structure. If you can envision all of them coming out the back with a lot of excitement, potentially fire, smoke, even the hubbub of all the people running about and so forth, to create mounting spots behind the building where the dogs would be led to and would be anchored for that time period of time. These are the type of things that probably most people aren't aware of, but need to be planned out with occupants as to how you deal with those type of things, how you take care of them. When the village did the extension for the 15 years and so forth, I spoke against it. I hope that we would not go as long as we did for that. It was decided at that time the question was asked, it was really a compromise with some of the property owners that came forward, asked for this and asked for that, practicality of contracting and so forth, practicality of planning, amortizing towards it. You've had 15 years to be planning and setting aside for that. I think the village, in the end result, was very generous. We worked and had many meetings with the churches in particular to come to the agreement that we had there, realizing the type and nature of use. In their particular case, one of the factors is you take life safety part of it. We know that their occupancy level is not on a typically 7 days a week where some of these other structures we're talking about. In their particular case, the primary concern, although it's life safety, and their alarm systems are such to move the folks out of the church quickly, is property conservation. You can imagine the impact of a church fire at Grace Methodist Church and so forth. So that's another one that's pre-planned, worked out with those folks and so forth. The codes that we currently have and the number of sprinkled structures that we have, we could go into the residential, that's very significant. We're well over, I think we're well over 90 homes now that are sprinkled and so forth in the village, but that's a different topic. That's not what we're talking about tonight. You folks are aware of the fact that the fire department last year was rated by the Insurance Service Office and so forth. We got a nice rating. One of the very large components in measurements of the department and its capabilities and the potential for fire loss and death in the village is our codes, our code enforcement, and the number of structures that are sprinkled. They actually, I mean, they have the detailed list of each structure in the village to the point of whether the building is or isn't sprinkled, what type of sprinkler system it has, how many square feet and so forth. The insurance company for each building owner knows this, knows what his ISO rating is. The ISO rating, sprinkled or non-sprinkled, that's up to the agent, but it potentially has an impact on that insurance rate. I'll just close with this. The question about fires. We'd all like to think there's never going to be a fire. There could be a fire any moment, anywhere in our village. We know that. That's why we have to maintain these systems and be ready to do it. We hope we don't, okay? Around the corner from the very large manufacturing, you folks may notice it when you go by Profile Plastics in our industrial park. It's right on Green Bay Road, on Waukegan Road. A few years back, one of their major multi-$100,000 molding machines caught on fire, put the potential entire business in great jeopardy and so forth. Sprinkler system went off, put the fire out, held the damage to the single machine. Okay? I think we all know, some people it's a misrepresentation that if a sprinkler system goes off, the whole building goes off and you're just drowning everything and so forth. It is progressive head by head. And those heads will go off, as the statistics showed earlier tonight, before people are dead. The other point I would make, just for an example, and then I'll close up, frequency of fires, significance of fires in the sprinklers system. You folks received a notification last Thursday, just this past Thursday from Drew, about a fire in our historic Village Market building. This building, this was a fire in that building. As we all know, it's a historic old building, presents incredible challenges should the structure become involved in fire. The owner of that building, on his own volition, decided to and retrofitted sprinklers into the building. The fire started in the basement. Why the building? The front portion, the coffee shop in the back was open. The front portion currently under renovation. There was no one in the building, and there was no one in the basement. The cause is yet to be fully determined, but the fire started in a large plastic rubbish can with construction debris left from the previous day. I believe the report's going to indicate spontaneous combustion, and it broke into fire. Significant fire. It was extinguished by the sprinkler system in the basement of the building with a single head. Of course, the activation of the sprinkler system sends the fire alarm Fortunately, we arrived shortly. Automatic response for a building of that magnitude calls for 6 additional fire departments to come to us because of the nature of that structure and our concern for potential fire. And when we have a water flow, that tells us we have a fire, as opposed to just a general fire alarm. Okay? We were fortunate to arrive in the building and find the basement fully charged with smoke. The first floor front portion of the building had substantial smoke in it, and there was some smoke on the 3rd floor. As we began to investigate, we found that the sprinkler system had activated and extinguished the fire. We were able to quickly go to the sprinkler system, which we're familiar with in our buildings, and turn it off. Mop up the water on the floor, basically, bring in our fans and move the smoke out. I would tell you, without too much drama, that our sprinkler system saved our village market. I will finish on that. Any other questions? I would hope that you would, the basic point, let me just say this. I think the basic point of Mike's discussion and what we've been talking about on staff is that occasionally there are structures that it's really not the thing to do. A commercial occupied structure, I will stand firm and say I believe it should be sprinkled, and it should have been sprinkled by now, so I would ask you hold firm to the 2026 date. A building such as the gazebo, the warming huts at the beach and so forth, they don't need to be sprinkled. We need to be making an evaluation on some of these auxiliary buildings as to what is the potential for life safety. In other words, all those buildings are open on 2 or 3 sides. People can easily move out. What is the fire load? What's the construction of the building? What's the nature of it, and so forth? One really...
David, can you please complete? We are running out of time.
Okay, I'll finish up. If you have any questions, let me know. Sorry I rolled on, but obviously I have some...
Compassion.
Question about.
Chief Graff, thank you so much for your testimony. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And because of the short time, I think there's some clear direction with regards to creating an exemption process, and we can draft that up and bring that back to another workshop meeting and share with that, and maybe even include other situations where the contents, there's some way to address that potentially too, in terms of just having a chance to be heard.
I think that conversation is important, and
Yeah.
I think we're running out of time here. I hear multiple points that are very important to the business community and to our fire safety in town. We take the comment and we have another discussion, basically.
Yeah, I think it's more review of the, some potential modifications to the building codes, and then also maybe even a draft communication out to the business community. Share that in.
So I would add one thing, and not a full-scale survey, but I would be interested in the immediately surrounding communities. If Ted's business were 1 mile south, would that be the same rules that would apply, or 1 mile, 2, 3 miles west?
Is that, Mike, is that something we can have reasonably?
Sure, yeah, we can do a survey.
Thank you.
Needn't be the whole North Shore, but I am interested in the immediately surrounding area.
Thank
Got
you.
it.
Are there any other comments on the board before we close? I would welcome a motion to adjourn this meeting.
So moved. Second.
Everyone in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.